Live from the BDN Studios, it's Bang and Dang.
That's awesome.
If you don't like that, then
You ain't black.
Welcome back to Battles of the American Civil War with Bang and Dang. And we still got some North Dakota or Dakota Territory fighting going on here as Sibley's still trying to get rid of these Injuns up there in the Dakotas. But we ain't done yet because next episode we'll have the last battle of this little thing that Sibley's trying to do here. But we also have the second Battle of Fort Sumter. We have a battle in Brooklyn, Kansas, and we have the Battle of Chattanooga, and the most messed up one of the day is the Lawrence Massacre, in which the Quantrill's raiders come and massacre about 150 unarmed men and boys. Yeah. The Union didn't take too kindly to that, let's just say that. First up, got Stony Lake, too, which is the Dakota. This says third and last engagement, liars. So next week we have Devil's Backbone. The White Hills Theater, or Whitestone Hill, was the culmination of the operation. So I don't get what they're saying there. Doesn't make any sense. Either or, we got Stony Lake, which was, they say, the third and last engagement of Henry Hastings Sibley's 1863 campaign against the Santee, the Yankton, the Yanktonai, and the Teton Sioux in Dakota Territory. Sibley fought the Sioux in the Battle of Big Mound, which we just had last episode, July 24th, and at the Battle of Dead Buffalo Lake on July 26th. The Sioux retreated westward after each battle, the warriors covering the flight of their women and children towards the Missouri River. Sibley anticipated that he might trap the Indians between his forces and those of General Alfred Sully, who was ascending the Missouri River with 1,200 soldiers. July 27th, the day after the Battle of Dead Buffalo Lake, Sibley marches 2,000 men 23 miles to Stony Lake and camped there for the night. Next morning, he broke camp before dawn and continued his march. Well, broke down, right? In the trail of the Indians. About 2 hours later, his scouts, mostly mixed-blood Sioux, reported a large mounted force advancing on Sibley's column. Oh, shit, they're coming to you, Sibley.
But they weren't expecting that. The Sioux apparently hoped to surprise.
Well, like these guys didn't know they had Sioux scouts for them. Like,
right.
Come on.
Come on. The Sioux apparently hoped to surprise Sibley, strike at a weak point, force him to abandon his pursuit.
Nah.
Warned of their approach, Sibley closed up his stretched-out column of soldiers, sent out skirmishers, and deployed his artillery. The Sioux warriors appeared shortly on hills in a semicircle with an arc of 5 or 6 miles around Sibley's forces.
Holy shit.
Sibley estimated their numbers at 22 to 25 hundo. The Sioux said their force totaled was 1,600 warriors. Most of the Indians, however, were armed only with bows and arrows, and they had some muskets, thus ineffective fighting at a distance of more than 100 yards.
Yeah, I'd say. Well, nearly surrounded Sibley's column, but having failed to surprise him, the Sioux probed for weak spots. Colonel James H. Baker's 10th Minnesota Regiment was in Sibley's van and advanced, firing volleys and supported by 2 mountain howitzers. The 6th Minnesota and 7th Minnesota Regiments deployed to the left and right of Sibley's wagon train. Charges by companies of infantry dislodged the Indians from several hills, and shortly the Sioux gave up the battle and faded away, which they've been doing.
Yeah.
Sibley was unable to pursue them as his horses and men were tired.
Of course they were.
He did not suffer any casualties, though. Good for him. Sioux casualties are unknown, but probably light.
All right.
3 Indians were seen to have knocked off their horses by an artillery round. Yeah, they're probably dead.
Most likely. Getting there. After the Sioux had departed, Sibley marched his men unmolested for 18 miles, and then he camped on Apple Creek, about 10 miles southeast of present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. He had anticipated meeting Sully, who was supposed to be proceeding up the Missouri River by steamboat, near where he was at, but there was no sign of old Sully. The very next morning, on July 29, 1863, Sibley sent 2 howitzers and his mounted rangers forward about 12 miles to attempt to prevent the Sioux from crossing the Missouri River. But he was too late. Most had crossed the preceding day, but in their hasty flight had been forced to abandon many of their belongings.
Oh, poor guys. Some of the warriors were still on the eastern side of the Missouri, and Sibley shelled them, causing them to swim across the river to the safer western side, where they continued to fire at a long distance on Sibley's men. 2 of Sibley's men, separated from the main body of soldiers, were killed. Sibley camped near the river, and the next 3 nights was subjected to constant small-scale attacks by the Sioux, who burned the prairie, fired into the army's tents, and stampeded some livestock. Oh. With Sully, supplies, and reinforcements nowhere to be found, Sibley decided on July 31st to abandon the operation and march back to Minnesota.
Might as well.
His horses and his men were wore down. Yeah, dude, you got open plains, traveling 100 miles probably.
The Indians are just playing with you, it seems like.
Pretty much. The Indians are like, dude, stop chasing us.
Right. Sibley proclaimed his expedition as a success, as he had pushed the Sioux westward across the Mizzou, far from settlements in Minnesota and eastern Dakota Territory. He claimed to have killed and wounded 150 Indians in 3 different battles at a loss to his own forces of 6 men. The Santee chief, Standing Buffalo, claimed that only 13 Indians had been moited. It is impossible to reconcile the different estimates of Sioux casualties, as it is determined with precision how many Indian warriors were actually engaged in the battles. Nobody really knows how many Indians there were.
Right. The Sioux took their revenge on August 3rd, though, 3 days after Sibley had left the banks of Missouri to return to Minnesota. They went and attacked a river raft and killed 22 civilians.
They ain't assholes.
Nor did raids into Minnesota seas, as 16 whites were known to have been killed by Sioux later in 1863.
Yeah, they're pissed.
Later that summer, Sully, tardy in joining forces with Sibley, would meet the Sioux in the Battle of Whitestone Hill. Okay, that's the one we're going to have next week.
So there's that.
Look at these guys, dude. Just leave them alone. What are the Indians doing? I don't understand it.
They want the land, man.
Okay.
These freaking Europeans want
Still
the land.
30 years before we even get to, or 20 years before we even get to the Indian Wars.
Right.
Well, more of the Indian Wars.
Yeah, because we haven't started expanding west yet. This little war right here is stopping that. Moving on. Second Battle of Fort Sumter. Fought September 8th, 1863, Charleston Harbor. Union forces retake Charleston Harbor began on April 7th, 1863, when Rear Admiral Samuel Francis DuPont, commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, led the ironclad frigate New Ironsides, the Tower Ironclad Keokuk, and the monitors Weehawken, Passaic, Montauk, Patapsco, Nantucket, Catskill, and Nanhat. He led them in an attack on the harbor's defenses. This was the 1863 Battle of Fort Sumter. It was the largest deployment of monitors in action up to that very time, though. That's cool. The attack was unsuccessful. The Union's best ship, the New Ironsides, never effectively engaged, and ironclads fired only about 154 rounds while receiving 2,209 from the Confederate soldiers.
Holy shit. Due to damage received in the attack, the USS Keokuk sank the next day, 1,400 yards off the southern tip of Morris Island. Over the next month, working at night to avoid the attention of the Federal squadron, the Confederates salvaged Keokuk's 2 11-inch Dahlgren guns. One of those guns was promptly placed into Fort Sumter. The Confederates, in the meantime, were strengthening Fort Sumter as well. Workforce of just under 500 slaves, under the supervision of Confederate Army engineers, were filling casemates with sand, protecting the gorge wall with sandbags, and building new traverse, blindages, and bomb-proofs.
Look at that shit. The only fort that they could hold. Some of Fort Sumter's artillery had been removed, but 40 pieces still were mounted. Fort Sumter's heaviest guns were mounted on the barbette, the fort's highest level, where they had wide angles of fire and could fire down on approaching ships. The barbette was also more exposed to enemy gunfire than the casemates in the 2 lower levels at the fort.
Well, right.
That's fine. A special military decoration known as the Gilmore Medal was later issued to all Union service members who had performed duty at Fort Sumter under the command of Major General Quincy Adams Gilmore.
Well, good for them. Care. He had a bunch of guns.
Yeah.
After the devastating bombardment, both Major General Quincy Gilmore and Rear Admiral John Dahlgren, now commanding the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, determined to launch a boat assault on Fort Sumter for the night of September 8th through the 9th, 1863. Yeah, because with Fort Wagner and Charleston, which we had a couple episodes ago, they were bombarding Sumter too.
All right.
Cooperation between the Army and Navy was poor, usually as Dahlgren refused to place his sailors and Marines under the command of an Army officer.
Right.
So 2 flotillas set out towards Fort Sumter that night. The Army flotilla was detained off Morris Island by the low tide. By the time they could proceed, the Navy assault had already been defeated, and the Army flotilla returned to the shore. Like, nothing we can do.
Nope. The Navy's assault involved 400 sailors and Marines and 25 boats. The operation was a fiasco from beginning to end. Poor reconnaissance, planning, and communication all characterized the operation. Commander Thomas H. Stevens, Jr., commanding the Monitor Patapsco, was placed in charge of the assault. When Commander Stevens protested that he knew nothing of the assault's organization and made some remonstrances on this grounds and others, Dahlgren replied, "There's nothing but a corporal's guard in the fort, and all we have to do is go and take position." He's saying there's only 6 to 10 men up in that fort. We can do it.
Doubtful. This underestimation of the Confederate forces on Dahlgren's part may explain why he was hostile to a joint operation, wishing to reserve the credit for the victory of the Navy. They always do that shit. Fewer than half the boats landed. Most of the boats that did land landed on the right flank or right gorge angle rather than on the gorge where there was a passable breach. The Union sailors and Marines who did land could not scale the wall.
Oh, no.
The Confederates fired upon the landing party and as well as thrown hand grenades and loose bricks. Damn, they had hand grenades back
Normandy all over again.
Well, Fort Wagner all over again.
Right. The men in the boats that had not landed fired muskets and revolvers blindly at the fort, endangering the landing party more than the garrison. The landing party took shelter in shell holes in the fort of the wall. In the wall of the fort. In response to a signal rocket fired by the garrison, Fort Johnson and the Confederate warship CSS Chicora opened fire upon the boats and landing party. The boats that could withdrew, and the landing party surrendered. The Union casualties were 8 killed, 19 wounded, and 105 captured, including 15 of the wounded. The Confederates did not suffer any casualties in the assault.
But they didn't. After the unsuccessful boat assault, the bombardment recommenced and proceeded with varying degree of intensity, doing more damage to Fort Sumter until the end of the war. Yeah, they just was there just blowing it up. The garrison continued to suffer casualties. The Confederates continued to salvage guns and other material from the ruins and harass the Union batteries on Morris Island with sharpshooters.
Very nice.
The Confederates mounted 4 10-inch Columbiads, 1 8-inch Columbiad rifled, and 2 rifled 42-pounders in the left face bottom-tier casemates.
Ooh, nice.
The last Confederate commander, Major Thomas A. Huguenin, a graduate from the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, never surrendered Fort Sumter, but General William T. Sherman's advance through South Carolina finally forced the Confederates to evacuate on February 17th, 1865, and abandon the fort.
Yeah, when the war is over.
Right.
The federal government formally took possession of Fort Sumter on February 22, 1865, with a flag-raising ceremony. The Union soldier was killed. One Union soldier was murdered, and another Union soldier was mortally wounded during the surrender ceremony. 52 Confederate soldiers were murdered there during the remainder of the war, while a number of slaves were killed while working at the fort. The exact number is, you guessed it, unknown.
Wasn't the Union soldier that was killed during the ceremony when they were raising the flags, like fireworks or something was going off, and he got busted up by one of those? Mm. Well, that brings us to our last one of the day, which is our biggest one of the day, the Lawrence Massacre, also known as Quantrill's Raid, which was an attack by Quantrill's Raiders, which was a Confederate guerrilla group led by William Quantrill on the Unionist town of Lawrence, Kansas. I said it was Missouri earlier. Sorry, guys. Killing around 150 unarmed men and boys.
Damn.
By 1863, Kansas had long been the center of strife and warfare over the admission of slave states versus free. In the summer of 1856, the first sacking of Lawrence sparked a guerrilla war in Kansas that lasted for years.
Damn.
John Brown might be the best known participant in the violence of the late 50s. Participated on the abolitionist or Jayhawker side, but numerous groups fought for each side during the Bleeding Kansas period.
Ooh-wee. Frickin' Kansans. By the beginning of the American Civil War, Lawrence was already a target for pro-slavery ire. Having been seen as an anti-slavery stronghold in the state, more importantly, a staging area for Unionists and Jayhawker insurgents into Missouri. Initially, the town and surrounding area were extremely vigilant and reacted strongly to rumors that enemy forces might be advancing on the very town that they are staying in. By the summer of 1863, none of the threats had materialized, just like climate change. So citizens' fear had declined, and the defense preparations were relaxed.
Okay, Lawrence was the headquarters for a band of Jayhawkers, sometimes called Red Legs.
Is that why the Jayhawks have red legs?
I didn't know they did. I thought they had yellow legs.
Is it yellow?
I'm pretty sure. It's a bird.
Yeah, but it might have red.
Oh, my red. No, it's definitely
orange?
yellow. No red. Got red buckles and a red head. What is a jayhawk?
A bird.
Is it a real bird?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
I think. They wouldn't just make a bird up, would they?
Yes.
Oh, it's a
A
mythical
bird with a fascinating history.
No shit.
Right. Yeah. It looks like a toucan almost. Yeah. Weird. So, yes, they would just make a bird up. Yeah, they initiated a campaign in late March 1863 with the purported objective to eliminate civilian support for the Confederate guerrillas. In describing the activities of these soldiers, U.S. Army General Blunt, which is James Blunt, "You're beautiful," he stated a reign of terror was inaugurated, and no man's property was safe, nor was his life worth much if he opposed them in their schemes of plunder and robbery.
Oh, man.
Indeed, many Jayhawker leaders like Charles Doc Jennison, James Montgomery, and George Henry Hoyt terrorized western Missouri, angering both pro-slavery and anti-slavery civilians and politicians alike.
No shit.
The historian Robert Castell thus concludes that revenge was the primary motive of this massacre, followed by a desire to plunder.
That's crazy. The survivors confirmed the retaliatory nature of the attack on Lawrence. According to Castell, the universal testimony of all the ladies and others who talked with the butchers of the 21st is that these demons claimed they were here to revenge the wrongs done their families by our men. What the? Done to their families? How about that? Is that these demons...
Well, this is a quote from somebody, so according to Castell, this is what he said.
That's what he said. He can't talk very much. Is that these demons claimed they were here to revenge the wrongs done their families by our men under Lane, Jennison, Anthony, and company. Charles Robinson,
Damn.
the first governor,
Hey,
first governor of Kansas, an eyewitness to the raid, also characterized the attack as an
Why
attack.
wasn't he killed?
Right. He characterized it as an attack of vengeance. He says, before this raid, the entire border counties of Missouri had experienced more terrible outrages than ever the Quantrill raid at Lawrence. There was no burning of feet and torture by hanging in Lawrence as there was in Missouri. Neither were women and children outraged.
I don't know what any of that means. The way that's saying is there was no burning in Lawrence as there was in Missouri, so it wasn't that bad.
Or it was just as bad.
Robinson explained that Quantrill targeted Lawrence because Jayhawkers had attacked Missouri as soon as war broke out, and Lawrence was headquarters for the thieves and their plunder. Quantrill said his motivation for the attack was to plunder and destroy the town in retaliation for Osceola.
Oh.
That was a reference to the Union's attack on Osceola, Missouri in September 1861, which I'm pretty sure we covered, led by Senator James H. Lane. Osceola was plundered, and 9 men were given a drumhead court-martialed trial and executed. What does that mean? As a court-martial held in the field to hear urgent Damn, so they just went out to the field and, heard the case right away and hung him. I mean, that needs...
that's a speedy trial.
That needs to be done to more people nowadays.
Collapse of the women's prison in Kansas City is also often believed to have inspired some to join in on the attack in a bid to put down the Missouri guerrilla raiders operating in Kansas. General Thomas Ewing, Jr. issued in April of 1863 a General Order Number 10, which ordered the arrest of anyone giving aid or comfort to Confederate guerrillas. This meant chiefly women or girls who were relatives of the guerrillas as well. Ewing confined those arrested in makeshift prisons in Kansas City. The women were sequentially housed in 2 buildings, which were considered either too small or too unsanitary, before being moved to an empty property at 1425 Grand Boulevard.
Or street or road or whatever. This structure was part of the estate of the deceased Robert S. Thomas, George Caleb Bingham's father-in-law, whoever that is. In 1861, Bingham and his family were living in the structure, but in early 1862, after being appointed treasurer of the state of Missouri, that's who he is, he and his family relocated to Jefferson City.
And he's left that big old huge house.
Right. Bingham had added a 3rd story to the existing structure to use as a studio, apparently. At least 10 women or girls, all under the age of 20, were incarcerated in the building when it collapsed on August 13, 1863, killing 4.
Jeez.
Charity McCorkle Kerr, Susan Crawford Van Dever, Armenia Crawford Selvey, and Josephine Anderson, who was the 15-year-old sister of William T. Bloody Bill Anderson.
Oh, shit.
You do not want to kill the sister of a guy named Bloody Bill.
No.
A few days later, Nanny Harris also died from her wounds.
Oh, shit. Survivors of the collapse included Jenny Anderson, she was crippled by the accident, Suzanne Ann Mundy Womax, Martha Maddie Mundy, Lucinda Lou Mundy Gray. Damn, they're all relatives.
Bunch of Mundys.
Elizabeth Harris, who later married to Deal, whoever Deal is, and Molly Grinstaff, Anderson's 13-year-old sister, who was shackled to a ball and chain inside the jail, suffered multiple injuries, including 2 broken legs.
See.
Rumors circulated, later promulgated by Bingham, who had held a personal grudge against Ewing and who would seek financial compensation for the loss of the building. The rumors were that the guards undermined the structure to cause its collapse. 1995 study of the events and affidavits surrounding the collapse concludes this is the least plausible of the theories.
Oh, sure, 100 and something years later.
Like they know.
Instead, testimony indicated that alterations to the first floor of the adjoining Cockrell structure for use as a barracks caused the common wall to buckle. The weight of the third story on the former Bingham residence contributed to the resultant collapse.
I would say so.
Even before the collapse of the jail, the arrest and planned deportation of the girls had enraged Quantrill's guerrillas. George Todd left a note for General Ewing threatening to burn Kansas City unless the girls were freed. While Quantrill's raid on Lawrence was planned before the collapse of the jail, the deaths didn't help at all, because it undoubtedly added to their thirst for revenge and bloodlust during the raid.
Well, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Gee, they don't care. They're just moitoring. Man, the attack was a product of careful planning. Quantrill had gained the confidence of many of the leaders of the independent bushwhacker groups and chose the day and time of the attack well in advance. Different Missouri rider groups approached Lawrence from the east in several independent columns. They converged with well-timed precision in the final miles. Man, these guys should be part of the actual army. Shit. They converged with well-timed precision in the final miles before Lawrence during the pre-dawn hours of the chosen day. Many of the men had been riding for over 24 hours to make the rendezvous and had lashed themselves to their saddles to keep riding if they fell asleep.
Nice.
Almost all were armed with multiple 6-shot revolvers.
Jeez. Henry Thompson, a black servant from Hesper, attempted to run on foot to Lawrence to warn the town of hundreds of raiders making their way towards Lawrence. Thompson made it as far as Eudora, Kansas, before stopping from exhaustion. An unidentified man riding a chase nearby rode by to ask Thompson if he needed help. Thompson said, "Well, yes, sir, I do." He had run from Hesper, he said, and needed to warn Lawrence. While Thompson and the man on the chase were able to gather some Eudorians to ride into Lawrence to warn the city to the west, none of them made it in time.
No, they did not. Around 450 guerrillas arrived in the outskirts of Lawrence shortly after 5 a.m.
Damn, they're acting like the damn police about to do all that. It is a raid, so.
A small squad was dispatched to the summit of Mount Orade to serve as lookouts, and the remainder rode into town. One of the first deaths was the pastor and lieutenant of the 2nd Kansas Colored Regiment, Samuel S. Snyder, who was outside milking his cows when he was shot by the passing raiders, who were making their way into town at that very moment. Snyder's death was witnessed by his longtime friend, Reverend Hugh Fisher. Their initial focus was the Eldridge House, a large brick hotel in the heart of Lawrence. After gaining control of the building, which then served as Quantrill's headquarters during the raid, Quantrill's force broke into smaller groups that fanned out throughout the very town.
Over 4 hours, the raiders pillaged and burned a quarter of the buildings in Lawrence, including all but 2 businesses. They looted most of the banks and stores in town and killed over 150 people, all of them men and boys. According to an 1897 account, among the dead were 18 of the 23 unmustered army recruits. By 9 a.m., the raiders were on their way out of town, evading the few units that came in pursuit, and eventually splitting up to avoid Union pursuit of a unified column into Missouri. Some families attempted to make the run towards Mount Orade in a last-ditch flight for safety.
Oh, man, this is crazy. The raid was less of a battle and more of a mass execution.
Clearly.
2 weeks before the attack, a Lawrence newspaper had boasted, "Lawrence is ready for any emergency, over 500 fighting men, every one who would like to see Quantrill's raiders." Yeah, would they? However, a squad of soldiers temporarily stationed in Lawrence had returned to Fort Leavenworth, and due to the surprise, swiftness, and fury of the initial assault, the local militia was unable to assemble any amount of defense.
Wow.
Most of those Quantrill and his raiders were not carrying any weapons. Before the Lawrence Massacre, a previous attack on Lawrence, the sacking of Lawrence, saw the pro-slavery attackers, led by Samuel Jones, a pro-slavery Missourian, who served as the sheriff of Douglas County, demanding that the citizens of Lawrence give up their firearms to the raiders.
Many citizens initially refused, but by the end of the sacking itself, many in Lawrence were left without a weapon of any sort, which, along with the swiftness of the Lawrence Massacre later on, saw Lawrence left defenseless against the attack. Because revenge was a principal motive for the attack, Quantrill's raiders entered Lawrence with lists of men to be killed and buildings to be burned.
All right.
Senator James H. Lane was at the top of this list. Lane was a military leader and chief political proponent of the Jayhawking raids that had cut a swath of death, plundering, and arson through western Missouri, which included the destruction of Osceola. Lane escaped death by racing through a cornfield in his nightshirt.
No shit, look at that. John Spear, who Lane had put into the newspaper business, was one of Lane's chief political backers and also on the list. Spear likewise escaped execution, but 2 of his sons were moited in the raid. One of Spear's sons may have been the same John Spear that appeared on a list of red legs previously issued by the Union Army. Spear's youngest son, 15-year-old Billy, may have been included on the death list, but Quantrill's men released him after he gave them a false name. Billy Spear later shot one of the raiders during their exit from Lawrence, causing one of the few casualties among Quantrill's command while in Lawrence. Charles Robinson, first governor of Kansas and a prominent abolitionist, may also have been on the list, although he was not moited. So clearly he wasn't on the list.
Right. This according to Richard Cordley, who was a minister in Lawrence and survivor of the attack. He says ex-Governor Charles Robinson was an object of special search among them. He was one of the men they particularly wanted. During the whole time they were in the town, he was in his large stone barn on the hillside. He had just gone to the barn to get his team to drive out into the country when he saw them come in and saw them make their first charge. He concluded to remain where he was. The barn overlooked the whole town, and he saw the affair from beginning to end. Gangs of raiders came by several times and looked at the barn and went around it, but looked so much like a fort they kept out of range. Right. Damn, this dude had a stone barn?
Right. Cordley was also on the list of men Quantrill wanted moited. In some of his writings, Quantrill later lamented that he did not kill Cordley, the abolition preacher. While many of the victims had been specifically...
He lamented? Does that mean he regrets it, pretty much?
Maybe. While many of the victims had been specifically targeted beforehand, executions were more indiscriminate among segments of the raiders.
I'm sure they were.
Particularly Todd's band that operated in the western part of Lawrence. The men and boys riding with Bloody Bill Anderson also accounted for a disproportionate number of the Lawrence dead. The raid devolved into extreme brutality. According to witnesses, the raiders moited a group of men and their sons who had surrendered under assurances of safety. They moited a father who was in a field with his son, shot a defenseless man who was lying sick in bed, killed an injured man who was being held by his pleading wife, and bound a pair of men and forced them into a burning building where they slowly burned to death.
Jeez.
Jeez, oh, Pete.
Another dramatic story was told in a letter written on September 7, 1863 by H.M. Simpson, whose entire family narrowly escaped death by hiding in a nearby cornfield as the massacre raged all around them. He says, "My father was very slow to get into the cornfield. He was so indignant at the ruffians that he was unwilling to retreat before them. My little children were in the field 3 hours. They seemed to know that if they cried, the noise would betray their parents' whereabouts, and so they kept as still as mice. The baby, even, was very hungry. He was very hungry, she or he, and I gave her an ear of raw green corn, which she ate ravenously."
Damn.
Ew. Many have characterized Quantrill's decision to kill young boys alongside adult men as particularly reprehensible aspect of that raid.
Right.
Well, obviously,
It's
dude.
ridiculous.
Stupid.
Bobby Martin is generally cited as being the youngest victim. Some histories of the raid state he could have been as young as 10 to 12 years old, while others state he was 14.
It doesn't matter.
Most accounts state that he was wearing a Union soldier uniform or clothing made from his father's uniform. Some state he was carrying a musket and cartridges. For perspective on the age of the participants in the conflict, it has been estimated that about 800,000 Union soldiers were 17 years of age or younger. Damn. With about 100,000 of those being 15 or younger.
What's that book?
Wow.
What's that book? I'm sure you read it in school, because I had to. And it was like a requirement about the kid. He's like 14, 13, and he runs away from home and joins the war. You don't remember? And then he ends up in like the mountains in like the Blue Ridge Mountains at some lady's house, and because he ran away from the war and shit like that. He was a drummer boy. I think it was the drummer boy or something like that.
Probably.
Yeah, it was a good book though. Yeah, but how many of them? Yeah, because usually they were drummer boys or like the band or something like that.
Right.
13, 14 years old. It's ridiculous.
Most of Quantrill's guerrilla fighters were also teenagers. One of the youngest was Riley Crawford, who was 13 years old when he was taken by his mother to Quantrill after her husband was shot and her home burned by Union soldiers.
Oh, she was like, you better raise this boy right like he's your own.
Take him.
Once the Confederates withdrew to the southeast, Lane led a small group of survivors of the massacre in pursuit of the men and was joined by a force of about 200 U.S. Army cavalrymen commanded by Major Preston Plum. They overtook the raiders south of the town of Brooklyn, Kansas, which we'll have coming up. But it was the Lawrence Massacre was one of the bloodiest events in the history of Kansas, I bet. The Plymouth Congregational Church in Lawrence survived the attack, but a number of its members were killed and records destroyed. Imagine that. A little-ass town, 150 people are just laying dead in the streets.
Right.
Cordley, the pastor at Plymouth, said that his congregation a few days after the attack, "My friends, Lawrence may seem dead, but she will rise again in a more glorious resurrection. Our ranks have been thinned by death, but let us close up, and hold the ground of Kansas. The conflict may not be ended, but the victory must be ours. We may perish, but the principles for which we contend will live."
Oh, good for you, bud. A day after attack, some of the surviving citizens of Lawrence lynched a member of Quantrill's raiders who was caught in the town.
This dude's got some fucking nuts, doesn't he?
Right. August 25th, General Ewing authorized General Order No. 11, not to be confused with Grant's infamous General Order of the same name. He evicting thousands of Missourians in 4 counties from their homes near the Kansas border.
Oh, damn.
Virtually everything in these counties was then systematically burned to the ground.
Damn.
The action was carried out by the infamous Jayhawker Charles Doc Jennison. Jennison's raids into Missouri were thorough and indiscriminate.
How many people did he massacre that they're not saying here?
Exactly. They left 5 counties in western Missouri wasted, save for the standing brick chimneys of the 2-story period houses, which are still called Jennison's monuments in those parts.
I wonder if they're still there.
I'm sure some of them are.
George Miller, a Missouri abolitionist and preacher, described the role of the Lawrence Massacre in the region's descent into the horror of total war on the civilian populations of both eastern Kansas and western Missouri. Viewed in any light, the Lawrence Raid will continue to be held as the most infamous event of the uncivil war, he says. The work of destruction did not stop in Kansas. The cowardly criminality of the spiteful reciprocity lay in the fact that each party knew but did not care that the consequences of their violent acts would fall most heavily upon their own helpless friends. Jennison in 1861 rushed into Missouri when there was no one to resist, and robbed and killed and sneaked away with his spoils, and left the Union people of Missouri to bear the vengeance of his crimes. Quantrill in 1863 rushed into Lawrence when there was no danger, and killed and robbed and sneaked off with his spoils, leaving helpless women and children of his own side to bear the dreadful vengeance invoked by that raid. Right. So the Lawrence Raid was followed by swift and cruel retribution, falling, as usual in this border warfare, upon the innocent and helpless rather than the guilty ones. Quantrill left Kansas with the loss of 1 man. The Kansas troops followed him at a respectful distance and visited dire vengeance on all western Missouri. Unarmed old men and boys were accused and shot down. Oh, see, okay. Yeah. And homes with their now meager comforts were burned, and helpless women and children turned out with no provision for the approaching winter. The numbers of those killed was never reported, as they were scattered all over western Missouri.
I guarantee you there was hundreds. Sickening. After the attack, Quantrill led his men south to Texas for the winter. By the next year, the raiders had disintegrated as a unified force and could not achieve similar successes. Quantrill died of wounds he received in Kentucky in 1865, with only a few staunch supporters left. Among those who remained by his side were Frank James and his younger brother Jesse.
Yeah, what did I say?
After Quantrill's attack, the U.S. Army erected several military posts on Mount Oread, of which a few were named Camp Ewing, Camp Lookout, and Fort Ulysses.
Okay.
They did this to keep guard over the rebuilt city. No further attacks were made on Lawrence, and these installations were eventually abandoned and dismantled after the war.
The Lawrence Massacre is a central episode in Wildwood, boys, a biographical novel about Bloody Bill Anderson by James Carlos Blake. Battle is also depicted in the Steven Spielberg produced 2005 miniseries Into the West, with Ang Lee, and in Ang Lee's 1999 film Ride with the Devil, as well as the Audie Murphy Western Kansas Raiders in 1950. 1940 film Dark Command, based on a novel of the same name, is a fictionalized events of the account of the events and much more of the classic B-movie Western style. The film bore no resemblance to the events of history. 1979 TV movie The Legend of the Golden Gun was about chasing down Quantrill and had some fiction in about Custer. Okay.
Whatever. There's a section in Charles Portis's 1968 book, The True Grit, in which the characters Marshal Rooster Cogburn and Texas Ranger LaBeouf argue about Quantrill. LaBeouf calls him a murderer. Cogburn, who rode with Quantrill, calls him a patriot.
Oh, damn.
LaBeouf ends the argument after Cogburn refers to Captain Quantrill, ridiculing the title Captain of What? The conversation later appeared in 1969 and 2010 films.
2010 film with Beau Bridges as a fantastic masterpiece,
Yeah,
by
the
the way.
69 one was better.
That's all right.
In Telltale's 2012 video game The Walking Dead, Quantrill's raid is mentioned as two characters, Lee and Omid, bond over Civil War history. Whatever.
Okay.
In Weekend Warriors, the 6th episode of Season 1 of Psych, originally aired August 11, 2006, a reenactment of the battle in Lawrence, Kansas, where Quantrill is moited, is the scene for the murder that is the focus of the episode.
Okay.
1968 movie Bandolero references this event as well.
All right, got a lot of references. Okay. And our last, I thought the Lawrence Massacre was our last one, but this is the last one. It's a little short little skirmish, because the people of Lawrence aren't done with Quantrill, because they're about to hunt him down. Skirmish near Brooklyn, Kansas, August 21st, 1863, between the raiders and pursuing Union forces immediately after the massacre. Later that day, after the massacre, some of Quantrill's men detected Union soldiers approaching, and the guerrillas left the town, moving the roads towards Baldwin until they reached the Santa Fe Trail at Brooklyn, Kansas. Brooklyn was 12 miles away from Lawrence. Local farmers had warned Brooklyn's residents of the approach of Quantrill, so the town was abandoned when the bushwhackers arrived. So they just gave up their town?
Basically.
Jeez,
Why not, right?
dude.
They don't want to die. Quantrill expected Union forces to already be blocking the route he had taken into Kansas. So he decided to withdraw into a southeasterly direction towards some woods around the Maria de Cygnes River.
Dude, this is America. Let's have American names, dude.
Right. He also ordered Brooklyn burned.
Of course he did.
All of town's buildings were destroyed except for the saloon.
I bet.
Historian Katie Armitage suggests that the burning of the town was possibly fueled by adrenaline and alcohol consumption. I mean, sure, alcohol has something to do with it. While a research paper published with Baker University proposes that Quantrill's men may have been targeting local members of a pacifist sector who had earlier been forced out of Missouri by pro-slavery advocates.
No, I think their adrenaline's still up by murdering 150 people, and then went to the next town and got drunk and was like, fuck it. Lane, who had survived the massacre by hiding in a cornfield, gathered about a dozen men after the bushwhackers left and followed after Quantrill, armed with pepper-box revolvers, knives, and shotguns. Lane's force gathered more men during the pursuit and reached Brooklyn with about 35 men. Lane's men kicked up a cloud of dust, which alerted Quantrill's guerrilla of their approach. The bushwhackers began a retreat, pussies. Force about 200 Union Army cavalrymen under Major Preston B. Plum, who had been trying to locate his forces since before the massacre, met up with Lane's force and made contact with the bushwhackers beyond Brooklyn. Shots were fired to no effect, and Quantrill's men began to become disorderly and panic while passing down a lane through a cornfield.
Oh, jeez. Guerrilla leader George Todd rallied 20 bushwhackers and charged the federal cavalry, driving them back with losses on both sides.
20 of these guys, and there's 200 of the other ones?
Todd was given command of the rear guard, and a pattern of brief firefights ensued as Todd's men would set up a defense and hold off the Union vanguard until the main Union force would catch up. At that point, the raiders would ride to reach Quantrill and repeat the pattern as they withdrew towards Paola. Makes sense, right?
Union forces attempted to set a trap for Quantrill in the area of Paola, but the bushwhackers fought off a small Union charge and then bypassed a planned ambush. Bushwhackers avoided a force of 150 Missouri militiamen at the Missouri-Kansas state line and had scattered with the Missouri by the end of August 22nd. Handful of the bushwhackers were later caught and executed, though. The Lawrence Massacre caused widespread outrage and led to the Union Brigadier General Thomas Ewan Jr. issuing General Order No. 11, which depopulated about 10,000 civilians from parts of 4 counties in western Missouri.
What are you going to do? You guys want to be...
We don't want none of you Missourians in our damn state, you pieces of shit. How about that? And that's the story of that. 5 more battles this episode, which we continue to move into the Battle of Chickamauga, which we will have in exactly 2 more episodes. This next episode, we will have the Battle of Bayou Mito, the Battle of Devil's Backbone, and the Devil of Whitestone Hill. And then we'll have the Battle of Second Sabine Pass, the Battle of Bayou Forge, not to be confused with the Bayou of La Forge, which we did earlier. And we'll have the Battle of Davis's Crossroads, which leads directly into the Battle of Chickamauga, which is the last big battle of 1863, and we'll have that all right here on the Battles of the Midwest Civil War. In the meantime, go check out According to Wikipedia, where this week's episode will be all about the Napoleonic Wars. So if you guys are war fans, which you must be if you're listening to this, we are reading the whole long Wikipedia page of the Napoleonic Wars, and let me tell you, that might even be a two-parter, because it's a long one. But either or, that's on According to Wikipedia on the Bang Dang Network right here. And Outlaws and Gunslingers, we are still in the middle of Mafia, wrapping up the Genovese crime family's top bosses and under bosses, street bosses, all those guys. So go check us out on YouTube at Bang Dang Network. And we'll be back next week for 3 more battles as, like I said, we move into Chickamauga. What is a bloody battle. And ultimately head into 1864. So we'll see you then. We are the Mother Michiganders with
Bang, dang.